Hey there, I'm Marie from DIY Montreal, and today I'm going to show you how I built this miter saw station. Now there are plans available for this build, so if you're interested, be sure to check the description down below. Now there are a lot of miter saw stations out there, so what's different about this one? Well, let me show you. First off, it has an expandable expansion wing. That way you save space, and you can just pull it out when you need to support long boards. Number two, it has an integrated T-track with stop blocks on either side. And not only does it harbor my miter saw, it also harbors my drill press. Now there's a removable platform in case you ever need to remove the drill press. You can just take that off. The other great thing about this is that it's a modular build, so you can build whatever sections you have room for if you don't have room for all of them, and you can adapt it to your needs. Other great thing is the whole total cost of this build for lumber is under $100, so it's super affordable. So, want to see how I build it? Let's get to it. My intention is to replace this old rickety workbench with the new miter saw station and stay within a similar footprint. After cleaning up the space and a new coat of paint, I was ready to begin. The base will be built entirely with 2x4s, so I set up a temporary work zone so I could use my miter saw to cut down all the lumber as per the build plans. In order not to get lost, I decided to build one module at a time. Next was time for pocket holes. I basically made 2 pocket holes at the end of each board that would serve as a horizontal stretcher. I could then turn to working on the assembly using pocket screws. I built up the first frame in a box formation that would make up my first module. You'll notice that I left the bottom front sides open, and this was intentional to allow flexibility down the line to decide how I want to use the space underneath the workbench later on. Saying that my floors are uneven would be an understatement. I have a huge slope and nothing is level. So to make things easier, I used a trick I picked up from J Bates and decided to use carriage bolts as leveling feet. After drilling a hole, I just tapped in a T-nut and threaded in the bolt. I repeated this on all the legs so I could level out the entire build. I then moved on to building the next module. This one will harbor my drill press, so I'm making it a little shorter, but otherwise the assembly process was essentially the same. After adjusting the leveling feet, I moved on to the third module. Now this one's a bit different, not only because I had to modify it to work around this column, but mostly because it'll include an expansion wing to support long boards. After flipping the legs upside down, I added 2 support stretchers from underneath, trying to keep everything square with the help of a level and a speed square. Now just a side note, the build plans do not take into account this column. Oh, and I also wanted to point out that you can just as well use regular screws and butt joints if you're not a fan of pocket screws. Alright, now I should have thought of making these holes before assembly, but in any case, the idea is to use a Forstner bit to drill all the way through. After a little sanding, I did a test fit to make sure the steel pipe would fit. Using the same Forstner bit, I drilled 2 holes using a depth stop set to 1 inch deep. Then over at the module, I did a dry fit to make sure the holes were correctly aligned. I made similar holes into another block, again not going all the way through, then did a dry fit with that piece as well. With everything sliding freely, I mixed up some 5-minute epoxy which I applied to both surfaces and pushed the steel pipe all the way in. After letting it dry, I applied some paste wax to the steel pipes to reduce friction and help the pipe slide smoothly. Before screwing down the plywood top, I first clamped down the top to test the extension wing and make sure it could slide smoothly. If you're getting too much friction, you can sand down the 2x4 just a little and test it again. Once I was satisfied with that, I could secure the plywood top with some screws after making some pilot holes. I went on to screw down the tops on all the other modules, but first added a center support piece to the module on which my drill press will sit. With all the tops on, it's important to ensure that all the modules are level before adding the middle platform that will harbor the miter saw. I tweaked the carriage bolts until I got it just perfect. I then built a simple platform using more 2x4s and pocket screws, and screwed down the plywood top. Next, I used my combination square to precisely measure the height of my miter saw's base, and so I could easily then carry that measurement over to the modules and mark all 4 inner legs. I used some clamps to help line up the platform with the markings, and then secured it with some screws from underneath. I also secured the other modules with a few screws through the legs. I did a quick test with the level to confirm everything was aligned, and success. I'm going to add an upper level to the drill press module so the top sits flush with the top of the workbench. So after cutting down a few pieces to size, I secured the top to the support legs. Note that this shelf will simply sit in place so I can easily remove it if needed, but because I'm going to add a T-track, I want to make sure that the shelf is locked into place and won't move, so I simply attached a couple stop blocks to secure it into place. I'm going to add T-tracks to the workbench with stop blocks using my router and this 3/4 inch straight bit, setting the bit height at about half the thickness of the T-track for the first pass. I set up a guide and I clamped it to the workbench to make sure I was nice and straight, and after the first pass I adjusted the bit so it was just above the thickness of the T-track, since I want the T-track to sit just below the surface of the workbench. After that, I cut my tracks to length and did a dry fit before gluing down the tracks. I'm using weld bond glue for this since it adheres to different surfaces like metal and wood. You could also just screw down the track, but I like to use glue. With the T-tracks in place, I could move on to making the stop blocks. I'm making these out of small blocks of walnut, but any hardwood will do. For the runners in the track, I'm using UHMW runners, but you could use hardwood for this just as well. I like to use these plastic runners because they're a perfect fit and won't be affected by changes in weather or humidity. So the idea is something like this, with the runners in the tracks and the T-bolt in the middle, and then a block on the top. But first I need to cut a small dado that will fit the runners. You can do this in different ways, but I find the table saw to be the easiest. After chamfering all the edges, I used some super glue to secure the runners to the stop block. And then made a hole for the bolt through the center. To finish it all off, I applied 2 coats of shellac to the stop blocks and the workbench top as well, making sure to avoid getting any into the tracks. Remember, if you're interested in getting plans for this build, be sure to check in the description below. The plans include 3D assembly diagrams, cut lists and cutting diagrams, materials list, and much more. While I show off a few of the miter station's features, I wanted to point out that I'll eventually be finishing off the bottom half of the build in a future video. I'm not sure if I'll make drawers, shelves, doors, or probably a combination of all 3 storage options. As for dust collection, for now I'll simply be hooking up my shop vac, but I'll likely address a more permanent solution in a future video as well. Hey, I hope you all liked this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, I'd love to have you, so be sure to hit that subscribe button. Until next time, thanks for watching, see you soon.